This is The Circus is in Town. I very much enjoyed writing this because it's an awful lot of it is based on fact. It was 4:45 a.m. and Mrs. C was shoveling elephant poo into the back of her turquoise Mini Clubman. She had been racing home from Annabel's after a productive evening, entertaining some overseas clients, when she had spotted tents over on the far side of Clapham Common. Manoeuvring her car around a milk van with the skill of a seasoned rally car driver, she came to an abrupt halt and stuck her head out of the window. There was no mistaking it. The circus was in town. Mrs. C's eyes gleamed as she expertly flicked the silk cut off the tip of her elegant black cigarette holder, inserted a new one and lit it. She took a deep drag and zoomed around the common. Nobody appeared to be around. A large circus top was at the centre of a cluster of smaller tents, to the left of which were several animal cages. Ignoring these, Mrs. C slammed her car into reverse and backed it up outside a small marquee, which housed 4 sleepy elephants. Looking down at the large piles of poo under their bottoms, she gave a small grunt of satisfaction. She rummaged around under the passenger seat and pulled out a sturdy garden fork before reaching behind to clear space in the boot. It took several minutes to shove the various bags, hats and shoes to one side. Then she got out of the car and traipsed over to the nearest and largest pile of poo. Oblivious to the fact that her black heels were sinking into the mud, Mrs. C started attacking the biggies with gusto. Within minutes, the Mini was half full, and there were little pieces of poo stuck to the sequined strands that swished at the bottom of her dress. Shoveling poo was quite vigorous work, and required a couple of cigarette breaks. She also had to wait a few times for the elephants to add to their piles, but it wasn't long before her boot was stacked high and Mrs. C was heading home, a broad grin on her face. The following morning, Nanny woke Mahatabel up early, so she could leave in good time for the Coomhurst country pile. It was half-term, but much as Mahatabel loved getting out of London, Rudy yet again proved to be a bit of a challenge. The last time Mahatabel had been caught trying to smuggle him into the car in her toy Barber, there was a useful hole under his trunk, Nanny had forced her to leave him behind. Although he had been safe enough at the back of her knicker drawer with a 3-day supply of worms stuffed into a can of pilchards, on her return, for the next week, Rudy had refused to even look at her. He made his indignation very clear by sitting with his back to her and moving away whenever she tried to stroke him. There was no way she was going to risk that happening again. So Mahatabel waited for Nanny to go and spend a penny, then placed Rudy carefully down one of her gumboots. She had to pop a couple of pairs of socks on top of him so he couldn't escape, and ignoring his slow hiss of protest, put him next to the suitcases by the front door. Nanny was just about to start taking their things out to the car when Mrs. C peeped out of her bedroom window. She was wearing a short pink dress and was looking exceptionally pleased with herself. "There's been a slight change of plan, Nanny," she said. "You won't be taking Mr. C's car anymore. I'm going to need you to take mine. I'll be going later with Mr. C." Nanny narrowed her eyes. "We'll have to take your gear," continued Mrs. C. "My car's already pretty full." Nanny blenched. "You mean—" She stared out at the Mini Clubman. There was something brown oozing out of the boot. Mrs. C raised an eyebrow. "Oh God, the circus is in town, isn't it?" Nanny fell to her knees, clutching her hair. "Not again!" "Yes, isn't it marvellous?" Mrs. C beamed at Nanny. "In fact, I have a little mission for Mahatabel. It won't take long, so you'll have plenty of time to pack up Mr. C's car." 20 minutes later, Mahatabel found herself outside one of the cages at the circus, inside which a very large lion was curled up, fast asleep with his tail over his nose. She was holding a couple of Nanny's special canvas bags that she liked to use at the supermarket. "Right," said Mrs. C, "I forgot to get any last night." "Get any what?" "Lion poo." "Lion poo?" Mrs. C pointed at several steaming piles. "Look, darling, there are lots of fresh, lovely lion biggies. Just what Mr. Folly needs to keep the foxes away from his chickens. A couple of bags should do the trick. We don't want to be greedy." You want me to pick up lion poo? Mahatabel blinked. The lion gave a snort and turned over. Of course, darling. And put it in a bag. Mahatabel put her hands on her hips. I mean 2 bags with my bare hands. Yes, darling. Now snap to it. We need to crack on. We don't want to hit any bad traffic. Mahatabel scooped up a handful of poo and tossed it in the bag. It was still warm. He doesn't look very happy. She looked up at the lion. It must be horrible being stuck in a cage like that. Mrs. C was on her hands and knees inspecting a large pile of poo. What was that, darling? Mahatabel carried on filling her bag. A small dark outline appeared from behind one of the tents and slunk over to the lion's cage. The lion, in fact all the animals, I'm sure they'd much rather be outside. Mrs. C looked over at Mahatabel. Not that one, darling. Mahatabel looked at the rather crusty specimen she was holding. It was drier than the first batch. What's wrong with it? That's not lion poo. Are you sure? Mahatabel couldn't quite believe she was having this conversation. There was the faint sound of scratching as something climbed on top of the cage. I'm pretty sure it's camel or possibly llama, which is of no use to us. Mrs. C crawled over to another promising mound. Give your bag a quick sniff to see if it smells the same. No. No, Mum, it all smells the same. Poo is poo. Mahatabel pushed her hair off her face, leaving a brown streak on her forehead. If you want it sniffed, you do it. The lion stirred as something slid across its roof, rolled over, and continued to snore. One red eye and one green eye looked down at Mahatabel as she thrust her bag of poo onto her mother's nose. There was a sharp yowl, and something leapt off the cage and hurled itself at Mahatabel. Her head jerked back as its claws latched onto her hair. She dropped the bag of poo all over her mother and put her hands behind her head and tried to pull what was ever on her off, and received several deep lacerations in the process. Look what you've made me do. Shaking her head, Mahatabel managed to dislodge her passenger. It slid down into her arms. It was her old friend, Mr. Blackcat. Oh, hello, it's you again. She reached out a hand to stroke it. It spat and tried to slash her again. You poor pussycat, you're frightened. A look of indignation spread over the cat's face before he dug his claws into her stomach, launched himself off her, and attached himself to her arm. Ouch, gently. Mahatabel again tried to stroke him. You want to cuddle, do you? The cat eyed her malevolently and scrabbled its way onto her shoulder. It raised a paw. It was just deciding which part of her to savage next, when a much larger paw flashed out of the cage and picked the cat up under its tummy. There was a blur of fur and sharp claws, and the black cat ended up squashed down on a huge metal can of lion food. Darling, we're in rather a hurry. Mrs. C was plucking pieces of poo out of her hair. This isn't really the time for a mud fight, so do stop teasing that poor cat and get back to work. Mahatabel ignored her mother and rounded on the lion. You great big bully, go and pick on someone your own size. She smacked him soundly on the knuckles. He retracted his paw, a hurt look on his face. Mr. Blackcat bounced off the side of the cage and onto the ground. He lay there for a second before scarpering over to the nearest tent. See? Mahatabel glared at the lion as she bent down and started packing poo into her bags once again. You scared him. The lion stared at her for a moment, shook his head, turned his back, and lay on the floor. Within seconds, his body was rumbling softly. 45 minutes later, heads craning out of wide-open windows, Nanny and Mahatabel drove across Chelsea Bridge. Mahatabel was sitting in the front seat. Normally this wouldn't be allowed, but there was no room in the back. That was now taken up with lion poo. Nanny clearly wasn't in a chatty mood. The car reeked. It was a very hot day, and the sun beamed down on them as they travelled in silence, all the way out of London. Mahatabel kept hoping she'd get used to the smell. As they waited at a set of traffic lights, the driver of the car on their left kept casting horrified looks in their direction and pointedly wound up his window. With grim determination, Nanny kept her eyes fixed on the car in front. Mahatabel entertained herself by poking her head out of the window and thinking of all the fun things she and Rudy would do once they reached the country. And wasn't it strange how she kept seeing that strange black cat? Next time she'd make sure she brought it back to the house. It looked like it really needed a good home. Suddenly, Nanny braked hard. They were on the motorway. Nanny was driving down the centre lane, and a BMW had just pulled out in front of her. The back seat came crashing down, and all the poo in the boot came gushing under the seats and gathered on the floor around their feet. The BMW slowed down again, forcing Nanny to press down hard on the brakes and consequently back into the poo. Mahatabel glanced down. Both she and Nanny were ankle deep in what Mahatabel realised was a mixture of both elephant and lion biggies. She looked over at Nanny. There was a look of such repugnance on her face that the giggle that had been building up froze in Mahatabel's throat. Then the BMW sped off, and Nanny was obliged to apply pressure to the accelerator, which she did with a noisy wet squelch. Mahatabel turned her head away, desperately trying not to laugh. "Are we nearly there yet?" Nanny glowered at her. 5 hours later, they turned down the drive, rumbled over the cattle grid, and made their way down to the stable yard. Mr. Folly was putting the lawnmower into the shed. He was a tiny man, walnut brown and wiry. Nanny opened her door, and several globules of poo dripped onto the ground. With all the dignity at her command, Nanny reached behind her seat, pulled out her handbag, shook it off, and placed it under her arm, then stalked off towards the house, leaving a tacky brown trail in her wake. Mahatabel went rushing up to Mr. Folly. "Come and look what we've brought you." She gave him a huge hug. "Mahatabel says it will be really good for your roses, and this bag is to keep your chickens safe." Mr. Folly looked in the back of the car and grinned. He walked slowly over to his shed, took out a shovel, and started depositing poo into a wheelbarrow. Mahatabel found Nanny in the kitchen, slumped in the rocking chair in front of the fire. Her handbag was on the paw, poo oozing down the sides. Mahatabel picked up a dishcloth and fanned Nanny with it. There really wasn't anything she could say, but maybe in a minute she could make Nanny a nice cup of tea.